Hello, welcome to Scary Stories for a Rainy Night. Before we begin, I just want to give a couple reminders to all of my listeners. If you have any scary stories of personal experiences, you can actually get paid to have them featured on my channel. Just click the link in the description to visit my subreddit, where you can post your stories and read others as well. If your story is chosen to be featured in a video, I will send you $20 for each one, and you can post as many as you want, just as long as they are your stories to share. Second reminder, there are only 3 ads in this video, after the first 3 stories. And last thing before we begin, please subscribe if you enjoy these kinds of videos, and leave a comment and introduce yourself if you're new here. My audience is the nicest, and they'll be very quick to welcome you to the family. Thank you for choosing to be here, when I know that there are many other options. Now, let's begin. When we moved into our new apartment, we were relieved to finally be out of the market for a rental property. Times had been really tough, and the struggle many people face just trying to find adequate housing in our country is intense. The apartment was small, but it was sufficient for the time being. It was the top unit of an old Victorian house that had been converted into duplexes decades ago. The exterior facade spoke of a different era than the interior, and subtle hints of the apartment's age were evident if you looked closely. Namely in the width of the stairwells, the style of the doors, the layout of the piping, and the way the house carried sound and echoed as it settled in the otherwise calm dead of night. As our family was growing, the timing of it all couldn't have worked out better for us. However, we soon began to realize that something strange was happening in our new home. I had come up to look for work and find us a place to stay when we received the news that we were expecting our first child. Leaving home in the 7th month of my wife's pregnancy was one of the hardest and most emotionally demanding things I have ever done. But I'm glad to say that in the end, it was the right decision for us, and it worked out perfectly. I got the news that we had secured the apartment on the very day that we were informed of the induction date for labor. It was all so perfectly timed, and I had enough notice to comfortably make it back home and be there for my wife and our upcoming child. Everything went smoothly, and before we knew it, we were the proud parents of a beautiful little boy with bright blue eyes and hair that would eventually settle on a pale strawberry blonde. He was and is perfect, and I am intensely proud of both my son and the work we did to prepare for his arrival. After the delivery, I stayed the night in the hospital with my wife. At 6:30 in the morning, I took the world's most expensive Uber ride from London, Ontario to Niagara-on-the-Lake to go to work early that afternoon and meet up with a realtor the next day for the code to the lockbox that held the keys to our unit. When I got the keys, I spent the first night alone in the house. It was just me in the upper unit for about 10 days while my wife prepared to move in from a few counties away. On that first night, I slept on a mattress on the floor that I had picked up from a local big box store, along with a few essentials and odds and ends to tide me over until my family arrived with the rest of our belongings. In the dark silence of the living room where I was sleeping, I heard what seemed like a knocking sound in the stairwell leading to the main door of the unit. I couldn't be sure, but it registered in my mind as footsteps, the kind made by a hard soul, stepping slowly up our side stairs and stopping at the door. I went to check but found nothing. The stairway was empty and darker than any other part of the unit, though still light enough from the moonlight peeking through the windows to confirm that there was indeed nothing there. I went back to bed, half asleep, and convinced myself that I was just hearing things, that it was an old house that I wasn't used to, and the sounds would eventually soften as the house settled. I figured it was something I would eventually get used to and learn to tune out as time went on. About 20 minutes later, as I lay in bed, I began to hear a shuffling at the door on the other side. With my back facing the doorway and my ears attuned to the direction of the stairwell, I started to notice the sound of footsteps again. Only this time, they were silent, more deliberately placed, and softened, as if someone was trying to sneak. I didn't dare move a muscle. As I listened, the steps came right about where my mattress was, and I could still hear the presence of someone standing right next to my mattress. The sound of feet weighing down on the creaking floorboards while standing in place. A displaced creaking made only by a person or living thing standing over the old floor. I didn't hear anyone come in. I knew it was impossible for someone to be standing there, right next to me in my living room. So I lay there with my eyes closed and pretended to sleep. Eventually, the feeling of presence seemed to vanish. I slowly inched my head around and opened my eye a crack to examine the room. I was indeed the only one in the room. I didn't leave my bed for the rest of the night and eventually drifted off to sleep, waking up to the sun beaming through the east side windows, the distant hum of traffic on the highway, and the chirping of morning birds in the trees lining the laneways. The year went by quickly, and many good things happened. Just under 2 weeks later, my family was together again, and we quickly settled into our new house and adjusted to city life. We celebrated our first Halloween together, dressing our son up as a little skunk, and had our first Christmas as a family, which was a magical experience that I look forward to repeating as the years go by. There weren't many creepy encounters, just the usual bumps and creaks in the night, which I still told myself was just the house settling. A year passed, and we received the news that my wife was pregnant again. Excited, though a bit financially stressed, I sprang into action as the responsible father. To our good fortune, we discovered that the tenants below us would be moving out at the end of August. I quickly jumped at the opportunity and asked the landlord, with whom we had built a good rapport, if we could take over the whole property. We now have a full house and more than enough space for our growing family. Despite money worries and growing pains, it is a beautiful house, and having the entire property to ourselves is a refreshing contrast from sharing the building with other tenants. There's a front parlor adjoining the master bedroom, and enough space for a small workshop for me in the basement. I eagerly set up my woodworking shop and other hobbies. My wife and I finally had a full bedroom to ourselves and moved into the main floor bedroom. We were a little anxious about being separated from the baby as we slept, but a baby monitor resolved that issue. We got the best model that we could afford and set it up close to his crib, with the speaker next to our bed downstairs in the master bedroom. One day, early in our rental of the whole house, I was downstairs alone, organizing the basement to set up my workshop, when I noticed the unmistakable pattern of hard-soled shoes walking on the hardwood floors above. It sounded exactly like the footsteps that I had heard on the first night I spent alone in the house a year ago, but this time it was coming from the main floor and occurring in broad daylight. I quickly headed up the stairs and checked all the then unfurnished rooms, and, like on that first night, found them just as empty as I expected. I was alone, and my son was upstairs, fast asleep after being put down for his nap. Maybe I'm just stressed about the change again, I told myself, and went back downstairs to finish up what I had planned for the day. I mentioned it to my wife, who didn't think much of it. She had heard all those pops and creaks before too, but I had never told her about the presence I felt on the first night. I didn't want to freak her out, and I couldn't confirm whether it was the house settling, an intruder, or something else. Then, one night about a week later, my thoughts began to change, and I started to believe that we might not be alone in the house. We were sitting in silence in the master bedroom, scrolling through social media and listening to the sounds of our son on the baby monitor, when the speaker began to hiss with loud static and crackle before returning to the usual sounds of the nursery on the top floor. Over the speaker, I heard an unmistakable voice, gruff and low, as if a man was standing by the speaker, talking to our baby. "Did you hear that?" I asked, jolting up and looking at my wife. "Yes. What is that?" she replied. "It's a man." We both quickly sprang out of bed and ran up the stairs to his room, finding him sitting upright, playing, blowing spit bubbles, and babbling away, nonchalant and carefree. I don't know what I heard, but I have been sleeping in the nursery for the past couple of days. I was never a huge believer, but now I'm not sure what to think. The thought of a stranger being alone with my son disturbed us both deeply. After that, I told my wife everything. The footsteps on the first night, the presence, everything. I was already having a hard time sleeping away from my son, but now, for the time being, I think I'll go back to sleeping on the floor upstairs. If you want to call it sleep. When my older cousin Harper was younger, he had a pretty sketchy encounter with two people on the trail in broad daylight. This happened in the middle of summer a few years ago. He used to be quite the avid athlete, often running from town to town via the network of trails that cut through the fields and concessions throughout the county. At that time, the town was in an economic lull, and things were rough for many people. While this was long before the opioid crisis, the whole region had experienced a significant influx of opiates, mostly notably OxyContin. With the cheap rent in the surrounding semi-rural community, the recession brought in an influx of newcomers from the cities. I don't mean to generalize. Most people who relocated were good, honest individuals who commuted long distances to their jobs in the city, but struggled to make ends meet in an urban setting. Unfortunately, with this influx came many social changes that people didn't exactly like, the most prominent of which was drug abuse and vagrancy, accompanying a struggling job market. Like a line of dominoes set to fall, some of the town's most beloved shops closed down, their windows boarded up. Panhandlers became a common sight along the sidewalks, and the scuffling and occasional arguments of squabbling junkies echoed through the alleyways. Concerned preachers from paranoid congregations seemed to preach about the evils of sin and vice on every corner. Times were tough, and the town became no stranger to newfound cracks in its once solid foundation. Theft became a regular occurrence. Shoplifting, burglary, and even muggings started dominating the local gossip. Like many of us, he loved spending time in this beautiful and symbolically important region. He enjoyed seeing and feeling the transitions from forest to meadow, and back to the cool tree canopy of the dense wooded valley, which led the local river to the shoreline of the nearby lake to the south. While it was common to see people enjoying the wilderness along the trails, you could also spend hours in the countryside without encountering anyone as you ventured into the forest. Summer days, however, tended to bring people out of their houses and onto the trails just to get fresh air or cool off in the evening breeze through the aged groves and whispering grasses of the meadows that wove through the lush greenery of the countryside. One day, as Harper jogged along the trail, he noticed two men off in the distance who seemed to be slowly making their way towards him. They were aimlessly wandering back and forth along the trail, doing something he couldn't see clearly. They were so far away that they appeared as mere specks on the horizon, growing larger as he approached. As he got closer, he saw that one man was meandering down the path on a chopper-style bicycle, and the other was some distance behind him, waving what seemed to be a large branch at the grass along the trail. As he drew near, he realized the two men were blaring music from a loudspeaker. The man on the bike, who was tattooed from head to toe, gave Harper a crooked smile and a tough guy nod as he approached. Harper, wanting to avoid interaction, slowed down and pretended to browse through his playlist as an excuse to disengage. As he passed the first man, he glanced up discreetly and noticed that the man with the stick wasn't waving a stick at all, but a large machete. Harper's heart began to pound as he scanned the second man, and he went into fight or flight mode. His sense of time seemed to slow as his sense of danger intensified, and he tried his hardest to remain as disengaged and inconspicuous as possible. He walked by silently, trying to stay calm. The man with the machete seemed to be in a daze, waving the weapon around in a bizarre display. Harper wasn't sure if they were looking for something or pretending not to notice him. Whatever the situation was, he was just glad to pass by unnoticed. Once he had put about 30 feet of distance between him and the men, he started to pick up his pace and went into a full sprint. As he kicked up gravel behind him, the man on the bike shouted to the man with the machete, "What about him? I bet he has something." Harper heard the man turn around and yell something at him as he sped away, but he didn't look back and kept running for dear life from the two strangers that he had narrowly escaped. According to Harper, when he was about 150 feet away, he veered off into the low-hanging branches of the box elders lining the trail and took a sharp left onto a narrow path where the trail branched off. Without hesitation, he leapt over the thicket like a deer fleeing from encroaching predators. As someone who frequented those trails regularly, he knew the woods like the back of his hand, and he could navigate them even in complete darkness. As he made his way down into the valley, he slowed to a stop to find his bearings and squatted low behind the thick trunk of an old tree in the midst of uprooting. As his heart began to settle, he could hear the two men coming up the main trail, shouting at each other and trying to figure out where he had gone. But it was no use. These men were unfamiliar with the woods. The forest was dense. Some of the trees were ancient and wide enough to hide behind. And by the grace of God, he had found a point in the valley where he could make his way down relatively safely, despite the stinging nettle of thorn brush that kept most people away. He sat there in the middle of the woods, waiting until he could be sure the men had moved on. Mindful of the noises above him, he must have been sweating heavily in the sticky, humid summer heat. Even as the sun began to set and the choir of bullfrogs and crickets started up, the seasonal heat lingered, especially after an afternoon of running or hiking. Although he wasn't clear on the exact location within the conservation area where the events took place, once you're down in the valley, you can follow the riverside straight into town if you don't mind getting your feet wet or your clothes muddy. As it happened, I ran into Harper that night as he was coming into town. It was late, and he had come up the pathway through the park that adjoins the conservation area just on the edge of town. It was well into the evening, and the sun had set hours ago. When I saw him, he looked absolutely exhausted, covered in sweat, caked with mud, and soaked from the knees down. He had a stunned look on his face, wide, vacant eyes, and a weary demeanor. I immediately recognized where he was coming from, though I wasn't expecting his explanation for why he was in such a state. Oddly, it took a while for him to tell me, but I can still remember the shock of hearing his account of the events that led him to walk the riverside back into town. This was the first time I recall hearing about a real, verifiable encounter with vagrants on the conservation trail. This took place a long time ago for me, so admittedly it is a little difficult to recall, but I'll try. I grew up in Canada, just south of the city of Brantford in rural southwestern Ontario. The area that I grew up in is proudly rural and is comprised of scattering of small towns and hamlets amid a seemingly endless expanse of fields, farmland, forests, and roads leading you anywhere else but here. While it is historically farm country and very much reflects that reality, it isn't entirely rural. My hometown is a small town in the twilight of its heyday. What was once a bustling place for my parents' generation and earlier is now surrounded by sprawl and a hollow downtown core. Things have changed, but in communities like this, you could paint over the most weather-beaten facade, and it would still be the old barn behind a quaint bed and breakfast exterior. In short, people are set in their ways. They want the same old things and seek no change for growth. There are very few jobs left, and in this age there isn't much merit in town, like that for someone trying to carve out a life. Nobody young from around here sticks around for long after high school. If you have any sense or a pull greater than your sense of nostalgia to seek better things, you go. And nobody blames you. It's not that anybody really hates it here. The vast majority of people who grew up here have a myriad of great memories of a mostly tight-knit community. Most of us love the outdoors, and many live by hunting and fishing. Farming is still the backbone of the region, and you would be hard-pressed to find people who don't have agricultural experience, or at least a love-hate relationship with farm culture, culminating in pride, if nothing else. But sometimes you have to go elsewhere to seek your fortune, and that's what most of us ended up doing. Since leaving home, I have moved around the province, working and gaining experience, practical knowledge, and perspective for wherever life took me. It never ceases to amaze me just how small the world really is. If you pay attention, you'll run into people from your childhood everywhere you go. Like a patchwork quilt, the small-town diaspora is interwoven into the fabric of every corner of the province, country, and indeed, the continent. You never know where you will end up, and more often, you never know where your path will cross with others, and with whom. When I do happen to run into people from home, they often share the same sentiment. Thoughts quickly turn to old houses, old neighborhoods, parks, and old woods. What fascinates me is that, more often than not, these conversations tend to turn toward paranormal. Whether it's a hot spot or just country boredom permeating our lives, who knows? But as time goes on, I find myself in similar conversations more frequently, which leads me to want to share my own personal encounters growing up. If there were ever a town that was haunted in its entirety, it's home. The overwhelming majority of people I know have at least one story about personal ghost encounters, creepy experiences, house hauntings, and hand-me-down stories from elder relatives. Obviously, I'm no different. The house I grew up in was small and relatively new. There was nothing particularly spooky or seemingly haunted about it. The first family to live in the house, and presumably the family that built it, were recent immigrants from Portugal, probably in the 1960s or 70s. Like most of the houses in our neighborhood, it was a 3-bedroom bungalow with a concrete foundation. My mother would call it quaint. We would call it small. The property was along a small dead-end side street next to a gully that led into a woodlot. On the other side of the woodlot was a park and a baseball diamond, bordered by a massive hill, where all the neighborhood kids would toboggan down in the winter. The house itself had a simple layout. The front porch led into the entryway and the living room, and the hallway passing through the living room by the kitchen stretched to the far wall of the house. Down the kitchen stairs and around a winding set of basement stairs was the laundry room, and 2 large rooms in the basement. One was converted into a secondary kitchen and pantry area with a living room and a fireplace adjoining it, and the other was an unfinished space intended for storage. Originally, this basement kitchen would have been the main area of the house when it was a Portuguese household. Traditionally, many rural Portuguese families' homes center around finished basements with kitchens, fireplaces, and ample space for living and dining. At one time, this would have been where families escaped the summer heat and kept warm during the winter months. Naturally, this is where the bulk of the activity would have occurred, and incidentally, any odd occurrences during the time I lived in that house happened from the vantage point of the basement. For the first couple of years, nothing particularly abnormal happened. The kitchen in the basement had long since been disconnected, and the appliances were removed before we moved in. In those days, the old kitchen counter was where we kept the box TV, next to the disconnected sink that we used to store all our cartridge video games for systems like the NES and Nintendo 64. We would spend hours, sometimes whole days down there in the dark basement, endlessly trudging through whatever video games we were playing. We would often have friends over for sleepovers and set up in the basement, sprawling out our games and staying up until 4:30 in the morning, just being kids and getting up to our usual shenanigans. I was always the kind of kid with a wild, overactive imagination. I was prone to hearing all the little bumps in the night, the rustling of the tree branch on the neighbor's shed outside my window, the creaking of the old exhaust fan in the kitchen, the gradual settling of the floorboards in the house as the dead of night passed, while everyone else was fast asleep. I was accustomed to having regular nightmares, to the point where it was something I just expected. Over the years, like any other kid, I was told by my parents that it was normal, that there wasn't anything wrong with that I just had an overactive imagination. I gradually came to accept that the noises and their origins were just in my head. So when my friends who had stayed over the previous weekend approached me at school on a Monday morning, I didn't know what to think when I heard what they had to say. "Hey, I know you wanted us to come over next weekend, but how about we stay at Rowan's house instead?" Yeah, that's fine. That's fine by me," I replied, a little confused because Rowan's house didn't have that much space for the whole crew, and his parents were a bit more uptight than mine. So all-nighters were definitely out of the question, which was our usual MO. "But why?" I asked, trying and apparently failing to hide my disappointment. Well, you know, we don't really go there that often." I could tell that my friend was dodging the question, so I persisted. "No, just tell me why. It's fine. Look, we know how you are. We just didn't want to say anything, but your place is starting to give us all the creeps, man. While you were sleeping Saturday night, Rowan woke up to what he said sounded like creaking. Something like that coming from upstairs. It freaked him out so much that he woke me up, and I heard it too. I heard it. It lasted for about 20 minutes, man." I couldn't help but let out a small laugh and a subtle sigh of relief. It was most likely the old exhaust fan in the kitchen. It had been a little rainy that night, and sometimes when the wind hit it at the right angle, it could be kind of loud and a little eerie. I told him that, but he shook his head. "No, I know what you mean. You've pointed that out before. I'm telling you, this was different, man. I mean, this was really loud. It sounded like something dragging along the floor, and then stopping over and over again, like a body or something." Perplexed and a little creeped out by what my friends had experienced, I shrugged it off and told myself that it had to be them playing some kind of prank on me. After all, I had been friends with these guys for years. We grew up together, and as they said, they knew how I could be when it came to this sort of thing. The bell rang, and like yearling sheep, we herded ourselves into the school and into our respective classrooms. I got on with my morning, my day, and the grinding monotony of my school week as it dragged on. By the time Friday came, it was all out of my head, and I was relieved to be done with school for another weekend of sweet freedom. To be honest, it had been a rough week, and I had elected to stay home and do my own thing that weekend. Rowan's house was always pretty cramped, and I was allergic to their dogs. I had gone out to rent a video game from the local corner store, as these were the days before you could download games. And after supper, I quickly got into my game as the sun set, and my Friday night began to unfold and waste away. Busy trying to get through some long introductions and tutorials, I ended up immersed in the game I had rented for a few hours. Before I knew it, it was the early hours of Saturday morning, and I needed to binge on some snacks. At this point in my childhood, my parents didn't really mind if I stayed up late, but if I was loud at this time of night, I would have gotten an earful. So I quietly crept up the basement steps and into the kitchen, trying not to make a sound, as I gently opened and closed the cupboards and stood in the glow of the refrigerator, trying to spot edible food in a fridge full of groceries. I always made sure to leave no trace when I went on my late night snack raids, and tonight was no exception. I tidied up and silently descended back into the cool, dark basement and the warm, static embrace of the old box television we used for gaming. It must have been about 40 minutes later when something seemed off. I perked up to better sense what had caught me off guard. It was then that I heard it. A faint creaking and dragging sound, followed by what seemed to be soft, deliberate footsteps from directly above me on the main floor. What is that? I thought to myself as I scanned my brain for any rational explanation. It couldn't be mice or something along those lines. Maybe somebody was awake upstairs? I listened for a solid 10 minutes, growing more and more creeped out as I sat in the silence of the basement, my heartbeat progressively quickening. The sounds seemed to get louder as I tried to figure it out. Eventually, I mustered enough courage to quietly wind up the stairs again and peek my head around the corner into the moonlit kitchen. The pitch-dark living room doorway drew my gaze begrudgingly toward it. Silence, stillness, and calm in the dead of night. There was nobody up there. I looked up at the cupboards and noticed they were all open for some reason, and I knew for a fact that I had closed them all and double-checked before coming down. I went to close them again and noticed one of the chairs was missing from the dining table. Looking into the living room, I could see the unmistakable silhouette of the missing chair. Light-footed and as quiet as I could be, I shuffled into the adjoining living room to grab the chair and put it back in its proper place. At this point, to say I was creeped out would be an understatement. While it could have been just my anxiety surrounding the situation, I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched from the dark, windowless hallway that connected the living room to the rest of the house. I put my head down and scurried through the kitchen and back down the stairs. But when I got down to the basement and turned the corner into the main room, I saw something that I could hardly believe. Though it took mere seconds to get downstairs after putting away the missing chair, in the basement stood all 4 of the kitchen chairs, stacked in pairs in the center of the room. For a split second that felt like a lifetime, I stood staring at the chairs, confused and taken aback by the sight of the chairs that I had just seen in the kitchen above me. When I realized that this wasn't right, and that this couldn't be anything other than paranormal, I quickly came to my senses and turned on my heels, bounding up the stairs with no regard for the noise of my feet stomping up each step. As I leapt up the flight of stairs, I heard behind me a multitude of murmuring voices that I couldn't understand. I recognized the language almost immediately. It sounded like Portuguese, but I couldn't tell what they were saying. Even if I were fluent, as the voices were all overlapping and almost whispering. A clatter of faint sounds accompanied what I knew to be voices, and it seemed to follow me up the stairs. I felt like I was being followed as I stumbled through the kitchen, into the dark living room, and through the pitch-black hallway to my bedroom. When I closed the door, I practically jumped into bed and buried my face in my arms and pillow. Not even a minute had gone by while I tried to calm myself when I heard something out in the hallway. A faint shuffling growing louder as it crept ever closer to my bedroom door. It stopped just in front of my door, and the floorboards creaked as if someone was standing just on the other side. I lay stiff as a board, trying to remain as calm and silent as possible. I eventually managed to control my breath and started to sink into sleep. Thank God I wouldn't have to be up all night. But as I started to drift off into the liminal dream state of oncoming sleep, I heard the unmistakable giggle of a woman echo through my thoughts as I finally sank into my dreams. Morning came soon enough. I awoke to a pretty normal Saturday morning in my house. Everyone was up. My parents were making breakfast, and the soft sound of morning talk radio played from the living room stereo. They hadn't heard a thing last night, although they did question me about why all 4 chairs were brought down into the basement. I had no real answer for this, and they wouldn't have believed me even if I had told them, so I just played dumb. I have never experienced anything like that since, and nothing remotely close to that ever happened in that house again while I was there. But for the rest of my time living at home, no matter what I did, I could never shake the sense of doubt that any sound I heard, any creaking floorboards, or any bump in the night was easily explainable. I'm making this record as a warning to all who may come across it. Never, never attempt to enter the catacombs of Paris through secret passageways that lie hidden beneath the streets of the city. For within those dark and winding tunnels there is something inexplicable and evil that resides the forbidden tunnels lurking beneath the City of Light. First, I would like to point out that the people I will mention here have had their names changed with the intention of protecting their memories and their identities. I hope that my decision is understood and respected by all. With that in mind, I will now begin the account of my Paris catacomb experience that forever marked my life. Like any other young person my age, I was very adventurous and loved exploring unknown places, always looking for thrills and challenges. My parents were always very strict with me, forbidding me to go to places they considered inappropriate, like parties and going out with friends. I felt trapped, like I was being deprived of experiencing the outside world, like other young people, which only fueled even more of the desire to venture outside the limits imposed on me. Like any other young person my age, I became rebellious. I lied to my parents that I was going somewhere, that I was breaking into an abandoned house or exploring some tunnel or underground cave with my friends who shared the same interests. But that wasn't enough. I wanted to go further, see new things and feel more of that butterflies in my stomach that only adventure can provide. That's why when my friend Zach called me and said that he had discovered a location on an unsealed sewer entrance to the catacombs of Paris, I was all for it. If you've never heard of this place or have only a brief acquaintance, the Paris catacombs are a gigantic underground network of tunnels and galleries that extend for about 300 kilometers under the city of Paris, France. The catacombs originally built as quarries around the 18th century and are currently visited by tourists as a historical and cultural attraction. The catacombs contain the remains of millions of skeletons who were moved there after the city's cemeteries closed. Due to their age and fragility, the catacombs have strict access rules to protect cultural heritage and the safety of visitors. In addition, the catacombs are a real underground labyrinth. It's not difficult to get lost in there. For these reasons, visits are highly regulated and controlled. Entering the Paris catacombs beyond the permitted areas for visitation was strictly prohibited. Violating this rule could result in fines and other legal penalties. I should have stopped there, but at that time all my rebellious mind had in my head was, everything forbidden tasted better. We called another friend, Sebastian, and started planning everything. When are we going? What would we take? And how would we not get lost? The last one was solved by Zach. We would use luminescent paints. And yes, when I look back, I realize how stupid this all was from the start. I don't remember what lie I told my parents, but they believed it, and I was able to meet my two friends without any problem. Entering the catacombs of Paris through a secret entrance in the sewers was always going to be the adventure of a lifetime. I was very excited and looking forward to this adventure, so different from the ones I've done before. Zach led the way. It took us about 20 minutes to find that entrance, because Zach actually didn't know of a location at all. He just heard a rumor that there was an entrance here. The entrance was narrow and dark, with only a shaft of light coming in through the crack at the top. Zach was the first to enter, followed by me and Sebastian. We managed to smell the strong and unpleasant smell of sewage in our nostrils. But that didn't stop us from moving forward. It was then that we saw a steep staircase leading even deeper. We walked down the stairs cautiously, carefully watching each step that we took. The sound of water running through the pipes echoed throughout the place. But that didn't bother me, after all. I was focused on finding something new. We arrived in a huge underground room, with dirty, damp walls and a slippery floor. The flashlights we carried illuminated only a small part of the room, and the surrounding darkness made it even more frightening. At first, I wasn't sure if we were entering the ossuary, or if it was just one of those sewer corridors. But then our flashlight beams began to reveal a few bones here and there, until entire walls adorned with bones and human skulls gave us a macabre welcome. As we made our way deeper into the catacombs, the air grew stale and musty. The damp walls seemed to close in around us, and the darkness was all-consuming. But instead of feeling afraid, we feel like those brave YouTubers with channels aimed at urban explorers who enter forbidden places like this. And that was amazing. The Paris catacomb was an incredible gallery of macabre art. It was impossible to deny the morbid beauty of that place. The walls were lined with stacked skulls and human bones, forming grotesque and frightening images. I couldn't help feeling that I was being watched through the hollow eyes of hundreds of skulls. I grabbed my cell phone and started filming around, capturing every detail of the historic structures, until an eerie sound echoed through the dark tunnels. Everything was silent until Zach said, "Relax, it must have just been a car passing overhead." He emphasized his statement by pointing to the ceiling above us. We relaxed after that. Zach's words made sense. We were somewhere under the city after all. There couldn't be anything here. The sound could only have come from the surface. As time went on, my earlier enthusiasm was turning into another feeling, which I refused to show to my friends, as I didn't want to tarnish my facade of a great and courageous adventurer. But I couldn't deny that little voice telling me something was wrong was getting louder. Filming Sebastian walking side by side to a wall full of piled up human bones, as he said, "Look at this. This is so cool," helped me to recover a little. Until then, I noticed Zach enter a different corridor and move further and further away. "Zach, don't go wandering around aimlessly. You know it's easy to get lost around here," I shouted. but Zach just responded with his typical arrogance. "Easy, Mom. I just want to take a look around these holes. I'll be right back." I rolled my eyes and continued filming Sebastian. I was used to Zach's habit of drifting away from the group and somehow never getting lost. It was from that point on that our adventure turned into a nightmare. Suddenly, Zach screamed from one of the hallways, causing me and Sebastian to turn around in alarm. I shouted his name and shined the flashlight on all the corridor entrances nearby, but I couldn't find him. Then sounds like bones creaking and clinking echoed through the galleries, making my blood run cold. "Zach, this isn't funny, man," I yelled loudly as I shined every entrance I could see, believing Zach was purposely trying to scare us. And then I realized that Sebastian was frozen, looking with eyes filled with utter terror in my direction. More specifically, behind me. And then I heard a low, inhuman snarl. Slow and terrified, I turned around. The flashlight shook in my hands, but I kept the grip as tight as I could to illuminate whatever was behind me. I had explored many unknown places in my life. I saw so many things, so many stories to tell, but never had I ever seen anything like it before. Before me was a creature that could only be described as something resembling a giant centipede, made up mostly of several bones of various widths and thicknesses, and what appeared to be exposed tendons and muscles. In place of its head was a massive human skull with large, sharp teeth, stained red, whose origin I refused to believe. That gigantic thing moved slowly with its many twisted legs towards us, staring at us with large, empty eye sockets as it rose with the front part of its long body until it surpassed our height and almost touched the ceiling. For a moment, we simply stared, unable to believe what we were seeing, until the grotesque creature released a high-pitched, screeching sound that made us shiver to the bone. We ran without looking back, trying to keep a strong and steady pace, following the luminous paint that Zach used to mark the way to the exit. But it was then that we heard the creature's heavy footsteps and its jaws grinding, that the adrenaline took over my body. I dropped the backpack to get rid of the weight, and Sebastian did the same. At some point in the panic, I lost my flashlight and cell phone too, but at that moment, material things did not matter. Miraculously, I managed to make my escape to the exit, but when I looked back to see if the creature was still following me, I realized with horror that Sebastian was no longer behind me. I headed back to the entryway again, even though all my instincts told me not to. I screamed Sebastian's name as loud as my lungs would allow, but the darkness only answered me with silence. That experience changed me forever. I will never be the same fearless adventurer I was before. I managed to escape with my life, but the price I paid for my recklessness was high. I lost my best friends, and now I live with this bitter and deserved guilt for the rest of my life. I didn't set out to hurt anyone. I certainly didn't want to kill anyone. I didn't have a choice, though. The pumpkin demanded sacrifice. I bought the damn seeds at Reggie's vegetable stall. David Decker bought his seeds from there, too. I was quite sure. David was a bit of a local celebrity, you see. He had grown the biggest pumpkins in the county for the last 5 years and counting. And for the last 5 years, I had to be content with second place. This year was different, though. This was the year where I beat David Decker and reclaimed my prize as the biggest pumpkin grower in the county. This year was different because Reggie said that he had something special for me. a secret weapon, if you will, and he assured me that it would finally wipe the smile off old Decker's face once and for all. Reggie found some special seeds. Blood pumpkins? I said skeptically. The package was old. It looked older than God. The paper had taken on that soft, velvety feel of a material that had seen the fall of the Second World War, and the seeds inside felt hard little bullets under my thumb. The paper declared them to be Bloodkerbis, and if Reggie hadn't told me what they were, I would have never known. Everything on the package was in a foreign language, and I would have sworn it was something that he had bought from a joke shop if he had not been so serious. Reggie was a practical joker, but his face was stone serious as he looked at me from across the counter of his vegetable stand. Blood pumpkins, he intoned back with deep seriousness. I don't know, Reggie. These things look older than God. Are you sure they'll grow? Absolutely. Reggie stretched the word into 3. Granddad brought them back from Germany, and he said the pumpkins he saw over there were huge. I scoffed. Your granddad was a sodbuster just like mine, Reggie. When did he go to Germany? During the war, same as your granddad, except your granddad spent it in Alaska. I wanted to take offense to that, but he was right. Granddad got a very cushy post, while Reggie's granddad had gotten half his leg blown off by a potato masher and was sent home with honors. Let me get my usual spread of regular pumpkins too, Reggie, just to be safe. So how did these work anyway? Any special instructions for these German pumpkins? Granddad always said that the man who gave him the seeds said that a sacrifice was needed to see them reach their full potential. What that sacrifice was, the man wouldn't say. But Granddad figured if anyone knows anything about sacrifices, it's farmers like us. He wasn't wrong. All the farming these past few years were one sacrifice after another. You sacrificed your time, your love, your family, your hair, and damn, nearly everything else, so you could afford to keep the taxes paid and the lights on year after year. Sod bustin' was nothing but sacrifice in many ways, and I figured I would plant the seeds and see what came of them. I honestly figured I would get more out of the other packs of seeds than those 2 old pumpkin bullets anyway. Looking back, I realized that I had no idea about sacrifice yet. I planted the seeds, as I had done for years and years, in the east field. As I stood up and rubbed the dirt off my hands, I looked across my field and felt the same sense of pride I always felt. The corn was coming up, potatoes and yams, beans and peanuts. The fruit trees were starting to bear fruit in the orchard, and my 20 acres was abuzz with growth. The July sun had beaten down on me as I shaded my eyes to survey my kingdom, and I knew it wouldn't be long before harvest time, packing time, and time to take another load down to Reggie so he could sell my harvest and I could lay enough back to make it through the winter. And once I win this year's grand prize for the biggest pumpkin contest, I would open my own stall in the following spring and sell my harvests like my father used to do. I was such a fool. The pumpkins grew slowly, as pumpkins do, but after a month, I had my eye on 3 that looked to be coming along nicely. I named them Hercules, Goliath, and Samson. They outgrew the others by quite a bit. It might seem silly to name a pumpkin, but I always named the ones I thought would be my entries into the fair that year. The other 40 or so would be sold to pie makers and pumpkin carvers and all sorts of other folks, but these 3 would be weighed, judged, and then made into pies by the missus for the pie contest to be held 2 days hence. I always laughed about it, but I always felt a little sorry to see her make those pumpkins into a pie after I worked so hard on their rearing. I named the blood pumpkin Fritz. It's a little different from the others. It was underperforming. Fritz wasn't even as big as most of the regular pumpkins, but I kept tending to him and hoping that maybe he was just a late bloomer. When I had gotten a pumpkin at all from the seeds, I had held out hope that maybe Reggie's granddad was right and that these pumpkins would be bigger than the regular ones I usually entered. I pruned it and weeded it by hand, just as I did with the other 3. hoping that maybe it would grow bigger and I could sell it as an oddity at Reggie's stand. While my other pumpkins were orange, this one was a deeper orange, like blood orange, and its leaves had a strange wilted look on them. I was certain it would make someone an extra creepy jack-o'-lantern when Halloween rolled around. But I really didn't have too high of hopes for the stunted little thing other than that. Then, one day in August, I got a surprise. A painful surprise. I was out tending to the pumpkins. My top 3 are still growing larger and fuller than the others, and while I was pruning around Fritz, I accidentally cut my hand with the shears. It wasn't a deep cut, just took a little skin off a knuckle. But like any wound, it bled a bit, and before I could snatch my finger back to put it in my mouth, a few drops of blood splattered around the pumpkin. I didn't think much of it at the time. It was just a cut after all, and I wrapped it in a bandana and got back to work. The next day, however, when I went to go check on the pumpkins, I noticed that something amazing had happened. The blood pumpkin had grown. It was smaller than even my smallest pumpkin the day before, and now it was almost as big as Samson, the smallest of my 3 entries. I had done nothing different, nothing besides giving it my blood. Then I remembered what Reggie said. He had said that the plant required a sacrifice, and I thought to myself that maybe this sacrifice was more than my time and energy, the sacrifice I would give to any crop. What if this sacrifice was my blood? As though I was in a daze, I pulled out my buck knife and slid the blade across the meat of my palm. The sting was little more than an afterthought as I squeezed my hand. I sent a dozen fat drops onto the ground beside the pumpkin. The drops splashed onto the vines as well, a single fat drop splattering the body of the gourd, and as it fell, I could swear I heard it grow. It was a soft, whispery noise like the trees in light wind, and the ground drank up my blood and left nothing behind. It seemed to grow before my eyes, looking bigger than it was a minute ago, and the next day, I measured 3 inches of growth seemingly overnight. For the next 2 weeks, I began giving the pumpkin my blood. It was never much, the amount you'd get from a diabetes test, but in 2 weeks, I noticed a change in the size of the blood pumpkin. In those 2 weeks, it grew as big as any of the pumpkins I had planned to enter. By the last week of August, it was twice as big as any of the pumpkins I had planned to enter, and Fritz was my new entry for sure. I imagined that anyone who cared to look would have seen the bruises on my fingertips and palm. My wife certainly made a lot of them, as she aided them at the dining room table, but she was the only one. I had a lot of visitors in the last week of August, actually. Someone, it seemed, had seen the blood pumpkin. My neighbor was the first. He could hardly miss a pumpkin that was nearly 5 feet tall and 4 feet wide, and wondered if he could come have a look. After that, I was visited every day by curious townspeople wanting to see my pumpkin. As I spent more and more time with the pumpkin, I began to worry that this was as large as it was going to get, topping out just shy of 5 feet, and started increasing the amount of blood I gave it. I was back to cutting my palm for the fat red drops I'd gotten before, but even that didn't make it grow. The ground drank, but the whispering growth didn't occur. I slept poorly. I began to neglect my other crops, and Fritz, the blood pumpkin, became somewhat of an obsession. On the 4th of October, I got the visit I'd been expecting. He called on me early, just a short series of knocks that dragged me from the table where I had been listlessly eating my breakfast. He wore overalls and a blue work shirt, boots with the rundown heels of many years of use, and a round-top brown hat that probably was meant to make him look like a cowboy, but just made him look even more like a farmer from a John Wayne movie. He hadn't taken the hat off, just stood grinning on my front porch as though we were the best of friends. "David, what brings you out my way this early?" I asked, with no real emotion. He grinned. "Well, I'd heard that I might have a spot to worry about this year. Seems like you've got a real contender of a pumpkin on your hands. Might I get a look?" I considered it. Sure, he had seen pictures and heard gossip, but in the end, I decided that I really didn't want him to see my pumpkin. Maybe it was jealousy, maybe it was mean-spiritedness, but I think it was something else. I don't believe the pumpkin wanted him to see it. Sorry, David, but if you want to see my pumpkin, you'll have to wait till the contest. I tried to close the door and found the tip of one of those run-down boots blocking the way. Come on now, just a peek. Hell, you've let half the town see it, so what's the harm in letting me have a glance? I said no, David. You can see it in 3 weeks when it's got a blue ribbon attached to it. He moved his foot then, allowing me to close the door, but when he nodded his head and showed me his grin again, I knew it wasn't the genial smile I had seen before. Suit yourself then. I'm sure I'll see it in due time. He was right, of course, but the scene would prove to be his undoing. He got his look 3 nights later. I was in bed, my wife snoring peacefully beside me, and as my eyes made a map of the dark topography of the ceiling, I heard a noise from the barn. It was subtle, could have been the wind, but I felt myself getting out of bed and walking down the hall and into the kitchen. I moved around the dark table and stood in the screen door as I gazed at my east field. It was late, midnight by the clock on the stove, and there should have been no way for me to see anyone in the field at all. Standing in the dark kitchen, though, I became very sure that I could see someone walking into my east field, carrying something with a long handle. I slept-walked from the house, silent as a ghost, and though the October wind sent goosebumps up my bare legs, I hardly noticed. I paused by the woodpile and wrapped my scarred hand around the old splintery axe that sat buried in the ancient stump. As I approached, I saw the person staring at the pumpkins, staring at Fritz, and in the moonlight, it was easy to see them transfixed by the silhouette of the swollen gourd. He stood stock still, contemplating the thing for nearly a minute, and I was less than 30 feet when he raised the tool in their hand and swung it down into the pumpkin with a wet, meaty thunk. I started to run then, bare feet slapping the earth, and he must have heard me because he turned. In the moonlight, I got a glimpse of a round, crowned hat and a face full of white, snarling teeth. I didn't register who it was, didn't even register that he was human, and my only thought was that this person would die for harming my pumpkin. I buried the axe in his chest, blade biting into the wood of the hoe, which he tried to use to block the swing, and as the wood splintered, I saw the blood splash across my undershirt and stain it red. David Decker looked at me with stunned and unbelieving eyes, but those eyes didn't fill with fear until something wrapped around his ankle. His blood had fallen on the ground between us, and even now, the earth was drinking it greedily. He turned suddenly, axe still buried in his chest, and as he did, he fell to his knees as the blood began to bubble from his lips. The red fell on the face of that unholy gourd, and I saw it grow and writhe before my very eyes, its vines twined around him, long stalks wrapping around him like the coils of some monstrous snake. And all at once, the earth began to writhe and churn as its roots came up to join its vines. In his terror, David struggled. His hands lashed out feebly with a broken hoe as he was dragged beneath the soil by the grasping vines. I watched. God help me, I watched as he disappeared into the earth, and all at once, I felt my knees unhinge, and I too was knee-bound on the soil of my east field. As the roots began to slide over me as well, I felt my mind slip away as the shadow of the blood pumpkin fell across me, now 6 or 7 feet tall and 5 or 6 feet wide. I could hear it growing and groaning. It grew with a sound like thin trees in a high wind, and as I blacked out, I never expected to have another thought on God's green earth, besides that last. My thought was that I finally made my sacrifice and that this pumpkin would take me into the earth as its next meal. I almost wished that it had. I awoke in the field with my wife standing over me and the pumpkin. that 7-foot tall behemoth of orange skin and green vines towering over us both. My shirt was clean, the ground was undisturbed, and all signs pointed to the night's events being just a dream, except for the broken hoe and the ugly little scar on the left side of Fritz, where the hoe had bitten into him when David swung it. David Decker was never seen again. The sheriff found his truck not far from my farm, and they came by one afternoon to ask some questions. Had I seen him? Had he been here? And did I know anything about his disappearance? I told them no. I couldn't very well tell them that one of my pumpkins had eaten him and stayed out of the nut house, and they believed me. They said that the visit was just a courtesy anyway, and that they wouldn't keep me from my harvest. The harvest that year was tremendous. The blood pumpkin wasn't the only thing that had benefited from David's sacrifice, and the yield that year was so great that I could have bought my own stand without the money from winning the contest. That hardly mattered now, though. Nothing really mattered at this point. By this time, I didn't care about anything but the pumpkin and keeping it happy. October 15th, 5 days before the contest, I began to notice a change in Fritz. Though still connected to the ground and still 7 feet tall, it was beginning to take on a definite sag. It was waxy looking, had an over-ripened look to it, and I had serious doubts that it would make it to the time of the fair. My blood would no longer sustain it, and whatever it had gotten from David was gone now. It appeared that another sacrifice was required, but I did not have the strength to catch its food for it. I had not the resolve to feed my neighbors to this unholy thing. I was sitting at the kitchen table and contemplating what I would do next when the knock came at the door. It was Reggie, the only one left in town who hadn't come to see the pumpkin. My wife was out visiting a sick friend. It was just he and me, and he wanted to see the pumpkin, the one he had heard so much about around the stand. Reggie had walked from his farm a few blocks away. He had probably told no one where he was going. I took him to the east field, and as he marveled at the pumpkin, I slipped my hand into my pocket. "This is wild. Granddad said they were big, but this is huge." I wrapped my hand around the buck knife I had used to feed it my own blood. Even if Decker hadn't disappeared, I'm pretty sure that not even he would be able to grow anything big enough to compete with this. Reggie had his back to me, and thus didn't see the knife slide out. "What have you been feeding this thing? Granddad said it took a sacrifice. You must have spent a lot of time out here." He was so lost in his own rambling that he didn't hear the metallic click as the knife came open. "Unless you've been making actual sacrifices out here in your east field," he said jokingly. "What's the secret, buddy? Virgin's blood? Goats? A little full moon?" He stopped talking when the knife slipped into the side of his neck, stopped talking, and started gurgling. The ground accepted him, and when my wife got home from her friend's house, the pumpkin was 12 feet tall. The judges came to my house that year to see Fritz, the behemoth, and I won hands down. It wasn't even a contest, really. The judges couldn't find a pumpkin even half as large as mine, and when my wife came for her early sacrifice for the pie contest, I gave her the other 3 instead. She seemed disappointed. Maybe she had noticed what a mania this pumpkin had become for me, but she took them anyway and won the pie contest that year with the tastiest pie that the judges had ever tasted. As she left my field, her arms laden with pumpkins, I first heard the slithery voice of the serpent as it offered me its apple. The voice was autumn wind and winter's promise, and I had heard it before, hadn't I? It was the voice that tells you that you can squeeze in one more crop before the winter. The voice that tells you that it wouldn't be that cold tonight, so there's no need to bring the livestock in. The voice of creeping winter that's hungry for its sacrifice. The voice told me that if I gave it my wife, my fame would be eternal. On that day, I turned away from it. On that day, I was strong. That year at my annual pumpkin patch, I was not so strong. I had arrayed my smaller pumpkins for sale, and even Hercules sat amongst them, since he had been spared. The people milled about the patch, looking in awe at Fritz the behemoth as they made their choices, and I saw the kid when he stepped a little too close to the massive pumpkin. He was a porker, a hefty kid from a family of hefty adults, and he had stopped to stare at the pumpkin as he held one of its smaller cousins in his pudgy hands. All at once, he shifted the pumpkin under his arm and stepped towards the mountainous gourd with a hand outstretched to touch. I started to stop him. I should have stopped him, but as I started to rise from my chair and raise my voice to warn him, I heard the voice of the serpent again, commanding me to stand aside. I sat back down and cast my eyes away, but even that didn't fully save me from witnessing the end. The police were called when they noticed his absence, and they searched my field and the forest beyond for a week without finding anything. His parents sat at my kitchen table, his mother crying into a square of silk as my wife poured tea and assured her that he would turn up, until nearly 10 o'clock that first night. I am lucky my wife was such a hostess, because all I could do was sit, shell-shocked, in a chair as she puttered about and made small talk. Everyone thought I was broken about the kid, and in a way, they were right. After all, it's not every day you watch a child get pulled under the soil while no one's looking. I won the contest the next year, too. People said I had a knack for growing pumpkins, but really, it was the same one. When it got 18 feet tall and 12 feet wide, it started to attract tourists. Some of them never made it back to wherever they were from. By that point, I was numb to the sacrifices. The pumpkin ate. The pumpkin grew. And as the tourists began to pay to see it, I found that I no longer had to grow anything to get by. The pumpkin made my farm a natural stop for tourists on the road, and they never grumbled too much about a few dollars here or there to see it. This was the year we took it on the road. We loaded it up on a flatbed trailer and took it to county fair after county fair so the whole state could see the world's biggest pumpkin. We did it for 5 years, and in those 5 years, I remember hearing about a suspected serial kidnapper plaguing the state. They dubbed him County Fair Kidnapper, as I recall, and in 5 years, he abducted more than 20 children and 5 adults from state fairs across the state. The state police even questioned me, not as a suspect, but to see if I had seen anything amiss, and I always told them no. What choice did I have? As I told you, when the pumpkin took Decker, I would have been slapped into a loony bin if I had come to them with stories of killer pumpkins or blood sacrifices. I am not blameless in this whole affair. I know that, and I have never claimed otherwise. But the pumpkin was good for my family. The pumpkin was good for the town. My pumpkin brought in the crowds, and the crowds stopped in the cafes to have a bite. They stopped at the gas station for gas and road snacks, and stopped at the farmer's market to buy fresh produce. They spread their money up and down the street from May till November, and the town always had a corn maze or a fair of some sort to draw them away from the pumpkin and back into the town proper. At one point, my face and a picture of the pumpkin were even on the town sign when you drove over the city limits. "Come see the world's biggest pumpkin," it stated in bold black letters, and at one point, you could damn near see the thing from the city outskirts. In its heyday, it towered up nearly 30 feet high and was wider than my house. It was blind to its feedings for the most part. Hell, I suppose you'd say I was complicit in the murders. I killed 2 for Fritz, and I'm responsible for all the rest in that I turned aside. But I didn't really grasp its slyness, its cunning, until the last time I watched it kill, when I watched it take my wife. I was standing in the back door watching her, trying to ignore the creeping voice as it told me it must feed. She was out in the field, tending some vegetables in the space I no longer used, and as I watched her, I began to wonder if I might resist this evil and win free. I had been this pumpkin's puppet for nearly 8 years. 8 long years of dragging its burden around my neck, and my heart was growing heavy with the burden of that sin. As I watched her in her purity and her love, I began to think that I might escape this evil thing and be the man I once was. We could leave, just pack our things and go, and leave this cursed earth behind us as we set out to start anew. She had noticed something was off, likely noticed from the start that something was off. But she was dutiful, and she was obedient, and she loved me more than I could ever love her. If I had loved her, I would have never let her get near that field again. She was coming in, carrying a basket of produce, and I remember the way she smiled when she saw me. Her face, that old young face of hers, stretched into a smile, and she raised her hand to wave as I stood framed in the doorway. I think I waved back, can no longer remember really, but whatever I was doing ended abruptly when she dropped into the earth. Dropped. Dropped is the right word. She didn't sink. She wasn't pulled. It was as though a hole had opened up and swallowed her in one gulp. Her basket fell, tumbling vegetables across the dirt, and it was all the evidence that I had that she was there at all. It laughed at me as I dug up the field, dug it up in furious crumping sweeps of the shovel, but I never found a trace of her. She was the last sacrifice I was a part of. I set up a fence after that and never let the tourists get close. They could pay their money and observe from a distance, but no one was allowed to go into the field again. It caught at me as I stood in my chair by the fence, saying that this was a useless gesture, but I ignored it and kept my silence. People will ask me why I didn't destroy it, didn't burn it to the ground, and to them, I would ask how stupid they think I am. I threw coal oil on it the night it took my wife, got loaded on whiskey first to muster my courage, and had intended to walk into the flames myself, but the bastard wouldn't burn. Any damage I did to it just healed, and all the while, it laughed at me. So I kept my vigil, kept my silence, and as we both lived, the town shriveled around us. It had gotten too powerful, you see, too evil to be contained, and those who spent time close to it became susceptible to its voice. They came in the night. They died silently in the field as they were drawn into the earth. They sustained that cursed thing. By now, they are all gone. The town is deserted, a ghost town in a country full of such towns, and the only thing to see is Fritz. Fritz, the world's oldest pumpkin. We are both shriveled now, a couple of relics from a bygone age, and if you come, you too can see him and have your picture taken. For $5 you can get your selfie and have a pamphlet on the 9th wonder of the world. But I wouldn't stay for too long. He's a shriveled old thing, small as he was before I dropped my blood on him. But if you spend too long in his company, you can start to hear his creaky old voice. You can start to feel his influence in your head. And one night, you'll drain your blood for him upon the soil. I'm old, over 100 years old now, and Fritz is a Methuselah of a pumpkin. My end is soon. I can feel it, and I often wonder if my guardianship of this cursed thing will mean a hill of beans when I am gone. Who will guard the world from him when I am dust in the ground? Who will keep the tourists back and the kids away at night? If you're listening to this, it may be you. And if it is, I am eternally sorry. If you have found yourself in the custodian of Fritz the Pumpkin, then I give you only one piece of advice. Watch him close, and keep that which you love away. Don't let him have the blood. Don't let him take another as his sacrifice. Let the cycle end with me. God help me, and let that damned thing wither in the field.